They thought it was harmless. Just another back-to-school ad. A cheesy little commercial with kids in bright t-shirts, laughing, asking cute questions, and making parents smile. Something you scroll past on YouTube without even finishing. Something you forget before it's even over. But this wasn't that. What the world saw as simple, wholesome fun was something else entirely. Hidden beneath the bright colors and children's voices was a declaration of war. Not a loud, chest-beating rant, not a social media meltdown. Something far more dangerous. A calculated strike backed by one of the most powerful corporations in America. And the target? The very players, veterans, and insiders who thought they could humiliate Caitlin Clark, box her out of her own league, and remind her who's really in charge. They laughed at her. They mocked her. They told themselves she was all hype, a marketing product, a passing trend. They thought they were putting her in her place, but the story they didn't see, the one that's only now being exposed, is that Clark wasn't reacting at all. She was already planning. And while they were busy playing games and voting booths and whisper campaigns, she was building a weapon right under their noses. Because this wasn't a defense. It wasn't even a clapback. It was something much worse for her enemies. A move so clever, so corporate, and so devastating that it turned their jealousy into the very fuel for her rise. What you're about to hear is not the story the WNBA once told. It's not the headline you'll find in their press releases, or the highlight reel they show on TV. This is the hidden war being fought off the court. A war that Caitlin Clark has already won. And to understand just how badly her rivals miscalculated, you have to go back to the betrayal. The moment that lit the fuse, the act that transformed a rising star into a cultural powerhouse who now controls the boardrooms as easily as she controls the court. The spark didn't come from a game. It didn't come from a buzzer beater, a highlight dunk, or even a playoff series. It came from a vote that exposed the deepest insecurity inside the WNBA. On paper, Caitlin Clark should have been untouchable. The numbers were staggering. Over 1.3 million fan votes for the All-Star game. A record-shattering total unlike anything the league had ever seen. To put it simply, the fans had spoken loudly. They didn't just want Clark in the game, they wanted her front and center. She wasn't just popular, she was historic. But while the fans were celebrating, something darker was happening behind closed doors. The league's veteran players, the women who had spent years building their own reputations, who had always assumed they'd control the narrative, made their move. When it was time for the players themselves to vote, they ranked Clark as the 9th best guard in the league. 9th. Let that sink in. The same player who was obliterating viewership records, driving ticket sales, and single-handedly pulling the WNBA into mainstream conversation was, in the eyes of her own peers, barely good enough to crack the top 10. This wasn't a difference of opinion. It wasn't about X's and O's or stats on a spreadsheet. This was personal. It was a message. Basketball Hall of Famer Dick Vitale didn't mince words. He called it exactly what it was: pure, unfiltered jealousy. And he wasn't alone. Two-time NBA champion Michael Thompson coined a new acronym for what was happening: jealousy, envy, egos, pettiness. 4 words that perfectly captured the venom dripping from that player's palate. But it went even deeper. Because the insult wasn't just about Clark's place in the league. It was about humiliating her in the most public way possible. The players didn't just rank her low. They elevated her own teammate, Kelsey Mitchell, above her. Think about that for a second. The people Clark goes to battle with every night, the people in her own locker room, were weaponized as part of the insult. It wasn't about rewarding Mitchell. It was about twisting the knife, making sure Clark felt the sting in front of the entire world. And here's the part that makes the betrayal so brutal. Clark wasn't struggling. She wasn't having a rookie wall season. By almost every meaningful metric, she was outperforming the veterans who voted against her.
She was breaking assist records, scoring efficiently, and carrying her team night after night. The numbers weren't just in her favor, they were undeniable. But numbers don't matter when feelings are in control. And the truth is, the old guard wasn't scared of her jump shot. They weren't even scared of her passing. They were scared of what she represented, change. Because Caitlin Clark is an outsider rewriting the rules. She represents a new era of attention, of media, of fans who don't care about hierarchy or unwritten rules. Her rise isn't a tide lifting all boats. To the veterans, it's a tidal wave drowning everything they've built. So they drew their line in the sand. They sent their message in ink, in ballots, in backroom whispers. They thought the humiliation would break her, shrink her, make her play small. They thought they had checked her. But what they didn't realize, what they could never have imagined, is that their betrayal wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. It was the exact spark Clark needed to unleash a counterattack so quiet, so wholesome on the surface that it caught everyone off guard. Because while they were busy scheming in locker rooms, Clark was already in a studio, building the weapon that would dismantle them piece by piece.
Most battles in sports are loud. Trash talk on the court, fiery post-game press conferences, social media call-outs that light up Twitter. That's the language fans expect when rivalries explode. But Caitlin Clark didn't play that game. She didn't storm into microphones demanding respect. She didn't clap back at the veterans on Instagram. She didn't even acknowledge the snub publicly. Instead, she smiled, and then she let her sponsors do the talking. Because while her rivals were laughing about ballots and votes, Clark was filming a commercial, one that looked, on the surface, like nothing more than a cute, family-friendly ad. Kids in classrooms, bright colors, a simple message about back-to-school season. Safe, harmless, forgettable. At least, that's what it looked like. But the brilliance of Clark's move was that it wasn't forgettable at all. It was a carefully engineered countermove that hit her enemies where they least expected, outside the court, in the culture war of relevance and reach. The veterans who thought they had put her in her place with the All-Star snub were suddenly forced to watch Clark's face plastered everywhere, not just on ESPN highlights, but on national commercials, social media feeds, and billboards. While they were busy protecting their spots in a league of 144 players, Clark was expanding her reach to millions who don't even watch women's basketball. Moms, dads, kids, casual fans. People who couldn't name 3 WNBA vets if their lives depended on it, but who knew Caitlin Clark as the smiling, approachable star with the corporate backing of billion-dollar brands. And here's the cruelest part. The veterans had no counter. You can block a shot, you can body someone in the paint, you can vote against them in a ballot, but you can't outvote Nike. You can't out-rebound Gatorade. You can't box out State Farm when they're putting Caitlin Clark in living rooms across America. It wasn't just marketing, it was power. A new kind of power the old guard never controlled, and one that Clark wielded without even raising her voice. This was the genius of her counterattack. It wasn't framed as revenge, it was framed as innocence, wholesomeness, positivity. While her rivals looked bitter and jealous, Clark looked like the future, smiling, unstoppable, untouchable. And just like that, the betrayal had backfired. What was supposed to humble her became the very fuel that launched her into a new stratosphere of influence. But here's the twist. This wasn't an accident. Clark didn't stumble into this. It was planned, it was strategic, and it was devastating. Because what looked like a single commercial was actually part of a much larger game, one that stretched far beyond basketball. Every great empire has an army. Some are built with soldiers, others are built with money. Caitlin Clark's army? It was built with kids. That might sound strange at first, but think about it. The veterans who wanted her silenced were only thinking about the here and now, about their contracts, their status, their minutes on the floor. They forgot about the long game. They forgot about the next generation watching from the sidelines. And that's where Clark turned the tables. In that so-called simple back-to-school commercial, the kids weren't just props, they were the message. Smiling, laughing, asking questions, looking up at her with admiration. That wasn't a coincidence. It was strategy. Because when kids see Caitlin Clark as their hero, parents follow, families follow, entire communities follow. Suddenly, Clark isn't just another player. She's a role model, a household name. She isn't confined to box scores anymore. She's shaping childhood memories, the kind that last decades. And here's the genius. No veteran, no matter how many trophies they own, can compete with that. Championships fade. Stats get buried in history. But once you win the kids, you've already won the future.
This is why Clark's rivals underestimated her so badly. They thought they were keeping her out of their club, but what they didn't see was that Clark was building her own club, bigger, louder, and more loyal than anything the WNBA had ever seen. An army of kids wearing her jersey, chanting her name, begging their parents to buy the shoes, the tickets, the merch. And when those kids grow up, they don't suddenly forget who inspired them. They become lifelong fans, lifelong buyers, lifelong defenders. That's the kind of loyalty corporations drool over. That's why brands are lining up to tie their names to hers. And that's why her enemies, the jealous vets who thought they could erase her with a snub, are fighting a battle they can't possibly win. Because Clark didn't just counterpunch. She recruited. She created a movement so pure and so untouchable that even her haters couldn't attack it without looking bitter and out of touch. Her rivals wanted her gone. Instead, she became the one thing they couldn't compete with, the face of the future. And once that future started marching behind her, there was no stopping it. But as powerful as this army was, it was only the beginning. Because the next step wasn't just about winning fans, it was about weaponizing corporate America itself. Here's the brutal truth. In today's game, power doesn't just come from the scoreboard, it comes from the boardroom. And this is where Caitlin Clark flipped the entire script. Because while veterans were busy guarding their minutes, Clark was securing partnerships. Partnerships that weren't just contracts, but alliances. We're talking billion-dollar corporations that don't lose. Companies with endless ad budgets, national airtime, and more influence over culture than the league itself. Nike, State Farm, Gatorade. Powerhouses that can't be boxed out, can't be voted against, can't be benched. And when they put their chips on Caitlin Clark, it wasn't just sponsorship, it was protection, a shield and a sword. Think about it. What can a bitter veteran really say when Clark's face is running on every TV screen in America during commercial breaks? How can league insiders try to bury her when entire corporations are pouring millions into making her unavoidable? This wasn't just endorsement money, it was leverage. Because every time Clark's rivals tried to keep her small, her sponsors made her bigger. Every attempt to shut her out only amplified her exposure. The more the league tried to humble her, the more corporate America doubled down, pushing her name, her image, and her story into households across the country. And here's where it gets ruthless. Corporations don't gamble on losers. They don't back players who fade into the background. If they've chosen Clark, it means they've already decided who the future belongs to, and they're making sure that future happens on their timeline with her at the center. Her rivals thought they were fighting Caitlin Clark the player. What they didn't realize was that they were fighting Caitlin Clark Inc., a brand so valuable that it transcended the WNBA itself. And the most devastating part, Clark never had to lift a finger. She didn't have to clap back, or call anyone out, or beg for respect. All she had to do was keep showing up, while her corporate allies turned every snub, every slight, every act of jealousy into free publicity. By the time her enemies realized what had happened,
it was already too late. Clark wasn't just a star anymore. She was the face of a billion-dollar machine. A machine that doesn't stop, doesn't forgive, and doesn't lose. But here's the twist. Power like that doesn't just protect you. It changes you. It reshapes the game itself. And for Clark, that meant stepping into something even bigger. A cultural force that her rivals couldn't touch no matter how hard they tried. Revenge doesn't always look like a mic drop. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is silence. The kind that comes when the game itself proves your critics wrong. For Caitlin Clark, legitimacy was her revenge.
Because while the veterans mocked her, while insiders tried to downplay her influence, reality kept stacking against them. Record-breaking ticket sales, sold-out arenas in cities that had never cared about women's basketball before. Jersey sales that left even the most established stars in the dust. Television ratings spiking every time her name appeared on the schedule. These weren't opinions. They weren't fan arguments online. They were cold, hard numbers. Proof that Clark wasn't hype, wasn't a phase, wasn't just media buzz. She was the product people actually wanted. The star fans were paying to see. And here's where the sting came in for her rivals. The very same players who had tried to freeze her out were now forced to benefit from her success. They cashed checks from ticket sales she generated. They played in arenas filled with fans who only showed up because of her. They watched their own salaries rise because Clark was pulling in revenue the league had never seen before. That's the kind of revenge you can't clap back against. You can't vote away full arenas. You can't snub Nielsen ratings. You can't erase the sight of kids in Clark jerseys screaming louder for her than for anyone else on the court. But Caitlin's revenge wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the shift of power those numbers created. Suddenly, reporters weren't asking about the vets anymore. They were asking her questions, building her narrative, centering her story. The spotlight was no longer shared. It was hers. And every time the old guard tried to downplay it, they only looked smaller, bitter, out of touch. Because Clark didn't need to call them out. She didn't need to say a word. The court, the fans, and the corporations said it all for her. That was the moment revenge became reality. Not in a fiery clapback, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that the game had already chosen its future, and it wasn't them. But even as Clark cemented her legitimacy, something bigger was brewing. Because revenge against rivals is one thing. Changing the entire culture of a league, that's a different level of power altogether. For months, Caitlin Clark played the role perfectly. The smiling star, the wholesome rookie, the approachable face of a billion-dollar marketing push. To the public, she was every parent's dream role model and every brand's safest bet. But here's what her rivals missed. Behind that smile was a sharp instinct. Because Clark didn't just survive the All-Star snub, she weaponized it. She turned humiliation into headlines, jealousy into fuel, and disrespect into dominance. That's not luck. That's not innocence. That's calculation. Watch closely, and you start to see the pattern. Every time they tried to push her down, she came back with something sharper. They froze her out of a vote. She answered with a nationwide ad campaign. They questioned her legitimacy. She answered with sold-out arenas and record-breaking ratings. They whispered that she was just hype. She answered by making herself the only name casual fans knew in the league. That's not just talent. That's predator energy. Because Clark doesn't just want to play in the league, she wants to own it. And she's proving that she can do it without ever raising her voice. No call-outs, no messy feuds, no social media meltdowns,
just a smile on the outside and a steel blade underneath. And that's what makes her so dangerous. Her rivals are fighting emotionally, with bitterness, jealousy, and pride. Clark is fighting strategically, with patience, precision, and cold execution. She doesn't need to win every skirmish. She only needs to make sure every battle, over time, ends in her favor. The sharp instinct isn't in her words. It's in her ability to let her enemies bury themselves while she rises higher. To take every slight and make it part of the story that feeds her momentum. To make sure every attempt to diminish her only proves her importance even more. And that's why the veterans' war against Caitlin Clark has already failed. They thought they were dealing with a rookie. They didn't realize they were dealing with a strategist. Because the truth is, Clark isn't just smiling for the cameras. She's smiling because she knows she's already won. But if this is her sharp instinct at the start of her career, the real question becomes terrifying for her enemies. How far is she willing to go once she has complete control of the game? At the end of the day, sports wars aren't just about stats or votes. They're about money. Cold, hard money. And this is where Caitlin Clark's rivals expose themselves more brutally than anywhere else. Because while the veterans were busy trying to knock her down, Clark was busy doing the one thing they could never stop: printing money for the league. Her Fever jersey sales, not just the highest in the league, they outsell entire WNBA teams combined. Her trading cards, one just went for over $660,000, an absurd number for a player barely in her second year. Nike, Wilson, Gatorade, State Farm, they all lined up to attach themselves to her name. And then came Eli Lilly, a billion-dollar pharmaceutical giant, dropping her into households across America with a corporate stamp of approval that even NBA superstars would envy. Meanwhile, what were her so-called peers doing? Wearing T-shirts at the All-Star game that said, "Pay us what you owe us."
Let that sink in. The same veterans who mocked Clark, who voted against her, who tried to freeze her out of the spotlight, are now demanding a bigger paycheck from the very pie that she baked. They want the money, they just don't want to admit who made it possible. This is the purest form of hypocrisy. For 28 years, the WNBA operated at a loss. 28 years, no profits, no mainstream traction, no real cultural presence. Then Clark arrives, and suddenly the league has record TV ratings, charter flights, and corporate sponsors writing checks like never before. And how do the veterans respond? With gratitude? With mentorship? With acknowledgement? No. With backstabbing, with jealousy, with a smear campaign that tries to convince fans and brands that Clark doesn't deserve the hype, all while cashing the benefits of the Caitlin Clark effect like clockwork. Here's the brutal truth. Caitlin Clark is the ATM of the WNBA, and the veterans know it. That's why their behavior is so twisted. They're stuck in a paradox. They hate her success, but they need it to survive. They want the spotlight, but without her, there is no spotlight. And that's why the Eli Lilly commercial hit them like a bomb, because it was a reminder that Clark doesn't just own the court, she owns the cash flow. She's no longer tied to the league for her relevance. She's tied to Fortune 500 companies, to billion-dollar industries, to the mainstream cultural bloodstream. The veterans thought they could punish her with an all-star snub. Instead, she punished them with something far more devastating: irrelevance. And here's the kicker. Every time they take a shot at her, every time they fuel the narrative of jealousy and bitterness, Clark's value only climbs higher. Another check clears, another endorsement drops, another record breaks. That's not just revenge, that's poetic justice. Because the league veterans thought they were fighting for respect. What they didn't realize is that they were fighting against their own paychecks. And Caitlin Clark? She's signing them. Caitlin Clark has already won the war off the court. She turned betrayal into momentum, smarts into strategy, and a simple commercial into a cultural and corporate blitz that no veteran could touch. She's built an army of fans, secured billion-dollar allies, and proven that success isn't just about talent. It's about vision, patience, and the sharp instinct to play the long game. But the war is far from over. Because while Clark dominates the headlines, the boardrooms, and the balance sheets, her rivals are cornered, desperate, and dangerous. They can no longer compete with her influence, her fan base, or her corporate power. So what's left? The court itself. The whispers are growing louder. Questions about aggression, intimidation, even safety. The old guard may not be able to stop her financially, but they could try to stop her physically. Every game next season isn't just about points, rebounds, or assists. It's about proving dominance in the only arena left where Clark hasn't already won, the hardwood. Fans are anticipating battles that could define the next era of the WNBA. Analysts are predicting rivalries that will go beyond stats and headlines. And the veterans, humiliated and frustrated, are reportedly plotting moves that could make the next season the most intense, personal, and unpredictable in years. Caitlin Clark doesn't just play basketball. She controls culture, commerce, and now potentially the survival of her own legacy. And the question everyone is asking is simple but terrifying for her rivals. When the cornered animals strike, will Clark's sharp instinct be enough to survive? The stage is set, the pieces are in place, and next season, the quiet war that started with votes and commercials is about to erupt where it matters most, in the games themselves. And one thing is certain, it's gonna get ugly.